Hi, my name is Susan Graham and I am a flutist and instructor in New Jersey. This is video number 5 in my tutorial series on the Bach Eb Sonata for flute. If you have not watched videos 1 through 4, I would encourage you to do that first and then come back and join me here for video number 5. Today we are going to be talking about the second movement, and we will be beginning right at the start of the second movement up through measure 21. And if you haven't put the measure numbers on your music just yet, I would encourage you to pause the video and then do that. That way you'll be able to follow along a little bit easier. Before we play this piece, it's really important for us to know what the word Siciliano means, so that way it can inform our playing. A Siciliano is usually a piece that is in 6/8 or 12/8 time, and it's characterized by a lilting feeling and very often has dotted rhythms. And you will find that this piece also has dotted rhythms. The Siciliano originates from the rustic dance of the people of Sicily. So Siciliano, Sicily, really sounds very much the same. And the dance is done with people that are holding handkerchiefs in between them. It's important to remember that this is a dance, and so therefore we don't want to go too slowly. I hear that very often in this movement, people playing it much too slowly. I would suggest a metronome marking somewhere between 104 to 112 to the 8th note. Another thing that is really important for me to mention is that this video series is mostly about nuance and phrasing and dynamics and not about rhythm. If you are unsure how to count in 6/8 or 12/8, that's something that you really need to work on with your teacher so that you can fully understand how to play this piece. One final note before we get started on playing the piece. It's very important for you to know the entire piece, which would include then the accompaniment part. If you look at the flute part and the piano part together in the score, you'll notice that there are constant 16th notes going throughout the entire piece. I kind of like to think of that almost like a boat song. It's just this constant energy that is going on underneath what's going on in the flute part. If you are playing this for the Regents audition, obviously it's not going to be an accompanied audition, but I would encourage you to either find someone who can accompany you on this piece, or at the very least, listen to recordings so that you know what's going on underneath your flute part. That way you're really learning the entire piece. When I mentioned our metronome marking, and I mentioned that our metronome marking was for the 8th note, we do really want to think about this piece in 2, or even to think about it in 1. If you put too much emphasis on every single 8th note, it's going to sound like this. Nobody wants to play like that. If you put the emphasis twice in a measure, and therefore it would be on the dotted quarter note, it would sound like this. But what's even better is to just think about 1 beat per measure. And that's really about feeling, not so much about rhythm. And it would sound like this. So notice that has a much more lilting feeling rather than a very heavy feeling. In measure 1, you'll notice that there is a little staccato dot over the second D. It's a D 8th note. I would definitely encourage you to just give a little lift right there. That not only will separate it from the D that follows it, giving a very clear articulation, but once again, it gives us that beautiful lilting feeling. And of course, you'll do the exact same thing in measure 3. Also in measure 2, you have this dotted half note. Don't just sit there and count it for 6 8th note beats. make the energy of that note move to the next measure. Actually, if you can play it in one breath from measure 1 through measure 4, that would be great. But if you do need the breath after measure 2, don't worry about that. Just make sure that the energy is continuing. And of course, at the end of measure 4, keep your head up so that you don't go flat. In measure 5, we see those same portato markings that we talked about in the first movement of the piece. Again, if you haven't watched the first 4 videos, please make sure that you go back and do that so you know what I mean by portato, or at the very least, look up what portato means. So what we want to do is gently articulate those notes. The other thing I want to mention is that the high C in measure 5, we want to make sure that we're balancing that with the downbeat of measure 6. We don't want that note to pop out. That's the way we don't want to play the note. The way we want to do it, of course, is to give the emphasis to the downbeat of measure 6. And on measure 6, that E flat to D is sort of like a little sighing motif. Ta, sigh. It kind of sounds like that. Like that. And that's a very common type of a phrase in the Baroque period. As we talked about in measure 5, looking at measure 6, that high B flat, we want to make sure that that's not really popping out. We're leading to the downbeat of measure 7. And I realize that is a tied note, so you're going to give a little bit of an air accent on that. So notice I kind of gave a little push at the downbeat there. And then when you get to measure 8, just make that crescendo really beautiful. This is kind of the first big moment that we have in this movement, and so we really ought to make something of it. I'm going to start at the end of measure 6. Make sure to count really carefully in measure 9, right before letter A. You have rests there. You don't know in your Regents audition if they're going to be asking for that part. If I were judging the audition, I would be listening to see if the player knew how to count those rests. So make sure that that's part of your practice time too, that you would be counting that note. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Obviously, you don't want to count it out loud. I'm just doing that for the benefit of those of you who are watching the video. In measures 10 and 11, we have the exact same phrase that we had in measures 1 and 2. So you're going to do the same thing. Do a little lift on the F 8th note before the 8th note F that follows it. And then make sure in measure 11 that you are continuing the energy of that E flat, whether you're taking the breath at the end of measure 11 or not. Just make sure that you're not just standing there on that note, but that there is a beauty to that note and it's got energy going into measure 12. We have then measure 12 phrase goes right into measure 13, and then there is a breath mark after the first 16th note of measure 13. This can feel a little bit awkward if you're not used to taking a really fast breath. And so what I would recommend is first practicing just putting the breath in the right spot and not worrying about being exactly in time. So like this. That way you're placing the breath properly. If you notice also that first note of measure 13 has a staccato over it, don't make it so short that it sounds like a hiccup. So a good way to play that part, if I started in measure 12, would be like this. So I'm giving that downbeat of measure 13 a little bit of time to sound. The D is a beautiful note, and it's really the most important note in that measure, so we don't want to make it too short. One more bit of advice about measure 13, we do have that high B flat, and we don't want it to pop out too much. We are leading to the downbeat of measure 14, and of course in measure 14 we have that beautiful sighing motif again. So I'm really leading towards measure 14. In measure 15, we have a crescendo marked, and I would really encourage you to sing out on those notes. This is the first time that we've really been in our upper register for a sustained period of time in this movement, and so singing through measure 15 and measure 16 would sound really beautiful. In measure 17, you have a few choices about where you could go dynamically. We could, in the second half of measure 17, keep the dynamic at forte, and then the second half of measure 18 would be an echo. Then we would keep it soft in measure 19 and make a crescendo through measure 21. The other possibility is that you could then get soft in the second half of measure 17 and then be louder in the second half of measure 18. And then you could either decide that you wanted to start soft at measure 19 and crescendo, or stay loud and make a decrescendo through measure 21. For me, I actually prefer the first way that we did it, which is staying loud at the second half of measure 17 and making an echo in measure 18, and then crescendoing all the way through measure 19 through measure 21. That's just a personal preference. Again, as I always say, talk to your teacher to find out which is the best way for you to play this movement. In the next video, we will talk about the rest of this movement, which will start at measure 23 and go all the way to the end of the movement. Please feel free to shout out any appropriate comments below, and if you haven't done so already, please subscribe. I hope that you enjoyed this video. Keep practicing. The next video will come out next Friday.